with the design of the experiment that limit the extent to which one can generalize about neighborhood effects on issues such as economic self-sufficiency. First of all, many MTO movers who experience difficulties in moving and obtaining apartments in areas of lower poverty relocated to neighborhoods that were not significantly different from the ones they left. For example, 3/5 of MTO families entered highly segregated black neighborhoods. Such neighborhoods tend to be considerably less advantaged than integrated areas. My colleague at Harvard, Robert Sampson, analyzed neighborhood attainment of all Chicago MTO families and found that after approximately 7 years, although the voucher winners resided in neighborhoods with poverty rates somewhat lower than the neighborhoods of control families, both groups clustered in segregated black neighborhoods that were still considerably poorer than what an overwhelming majority of Americans will ever experience. Neighborhoods with poverty rates of roughly 30%. Furthermore, as pointed out by economists John Quigley and Stephen Raphael, the experiment did not improve accessibility to employment opportunities for MTO movers because their new areas were no closer to areas of employment growth. And Lawrence Katz, the economist and one of the co-authors of the article in Science, told the New York Times that, quote, "The preference for educated workers in this country was so strong that changing neighborhoods did not do much to improve the job options for the participants, who were mostly African American women without college education," unquote. And finally, the adults who entered the program have been exposed all their lives to the effects of severely concentrated disadvantage. And no matter how long they are followed in a new neighborhood, the effects of those earlier years are not fully erased. And so for all these reasons, their new neighborhoods were highly unlikely to result in significant improvements in economic self-sufficiency, despite being safer and less distressed. However, I want to emphasize that the MTO experiment is not the most ideal research design to capture the long-term cumulative effects of concentrated poverty, especially concentrated poverty in racially segregated neighborhoods. And I would therefore like to focus briefly on several important recent longitudinal studies that were designed to measure the cumulative effects of living in high poverty and segregated neighborhoods. And I begin with the research of one of my former students, Patrick Sharkey, who's now at New York University, as presented in his recent book, Stuck in Place, subtitled Urban Neighborhoods and the End of Progress Toward Racial Equality. Analyzing data from the panel study of income dynamics, what we call the PSID, with methods that measure intergenerational economic mobility, Sharkey demonstrates the importance of gauging the longer-term effects of living in poor neighborhoods when considering racial differences. He states, quote, "When white families live in a poor neighborhood, they typically do so for only one generation. In Black American families, neighborhood poverty is commonly multi-generational," unquote. And he also found that since the 1970s, a majority of black families resided in the poorest quarter of neighborhoods in consecutive generations, compared to only 7% of white families. And that, quote, 72% of black adults living in today's urban ghettos, that is, neighborhoods that are majority black and among the poorest quarter of all American neighborhoods, were raised by parents who also lived in the ghetto a generation earlier, unquote. In short, Sharkey states that the problem of the urban ghetto is not simply that it has persisted over time, but that the same families have experienced the disadvantages associated with life in the ghetto over multiple generations. And this problem can be particularly severe for children. For example, consider another important and related study on children's development that Sharkey co-authored with Robert Sampson and Stephen Rodenbush, who's at the University of Chicago, Sampson in the Psychology Department, which examined the durable effects of concentrated poverty on black children's verbal ability. And they studied a representative sample of 750 African American children, ages 6 to 12, who were growing up in the city of Chicago in 1995, and followed them for up to 7 years. And the children were given a reading examination and vocabulary tests at 3 different periods. And their study shows that residing in a severely disadvantaged neighborhood cumulatively impedes the development of academically relevant ability for children, which certainly has consequences for school performances, including the completion of high school. For example, Jeffrey Watke, David Harding, and Felix Hurwitz used the panel study of income dynamics at PSID to examine the effects of long-term exposure to disadvantaged neighborhoods on high school graduation. And they tracked 4,154 children by measuring their neighborhood context once each year from age 1 to 17, and found that continuous exposure to disadvantaged neighborhoods featuring high rates of poverty, unemployment, single-parent households, and welfare receipt, as well as few well-educated adults, throughout the entire childhood life course has a devastating impact on the chances of graduating from high school. Now, each of these longitudinal studies was guided by theoretical arguments. However, perhaps the study that most dramatically addresses Jinks and Mayer's concerns, studies of neighborhood effects, should include empirical measures of neighborhood variables that are theoretically based, is Robert Sampson's recently published book, Great American City, Chicago, and the Enduring Neighborhood Effect. Sampson is a quantitative social scientist who understands the logic of social scientific inquiry, and therefore the importance of integrating the structure of explanation, the meaning and significance of concepts, and the nature of evidence. In Sampson's research, empirical measures of concepts and analysis of data are theoretically motivated. And he fully exploits his very rich data set by taking a pluralistic stance on the nature of evidence to assess causation. And his findings flow mainly from a comprehensive research endeavor called the Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods. And using the iconic city of Chicago as a laboratory, the project collected longitudinal data on children, families, and neighborhoods, and it is one of the most ambitious and creative research projects in the history of social science inquiry. And Sampson analyzed how the mechanisms of social causality are shaped by the integration of individual, neighborhood, and structural dynamics. And in the process, he demonstrates the powerful effects of ecologically concentrated disadvantage areas, such as the inner city ghetto, on both individual outcomes and rates of social behavior across neighborhoods, including poverty, joblessness, single-parent families with children, verbal ability, violence, incarceration, and collective efficacy. And he shows how these effects are magnified by racial segregation. I strongly recommend this book. It's not an easy read. Great Robert Sampson, Great American City. But if you endure, you'll be well rewarded if you can read it. The entire book. How many sociologists in the group? How many of you have read this Sampson's book? Nobody? Great American City, published by the University of Chicago Press. Now, all of the studies I have reviewed, following the publication of the Jinks and Mayer's papers, clearly reveal the importance of neighborhoods on social outcomes. And I hasten to point out that these are the kinds of studies that Jinks and Mayer actually called for in 1990. And I suspect that if these studies had existed at the time they wrote their papers, they would have obviously had a different view of the power of neighborhood effects. And I would like to now move in the latter part of my talk from a critical reflection of the literature to my own thoughts about the power of neighborhood effects, keeping the city of Detroit in mind. Nowhere is the power of neighborhood effects more clearly seen than in many inner-city black ghettos that have experienced significant depopulation following the secession of the great migration wave of blacks from the South seeking employment opportunities in burgeoning northern industries, which characterized a good part of the 20th century. However, the Great Migration abruptly ended around 1970 in the face of accelerated out-migration of central city manufacturing due to improvements in transportation and the suburbanization of employment. So, with the cessation of migration from the South and the out-migration of higher-income families, many poor, black, inner-city neighborhoods, especially those in the Midwest and Northeast, changed from densely populated communities of recently arrived migrants to depopulated areas with thousands of vacant lots and abandoned buildings. And these neighborhoods have been slow to revive because of the combined effects of poverty and racial segregation. Many working and middle-class black families have left these neighborhoods, but their ranks, for the most part, have neither been replaced with new migrants flowing into this country, nor with other non-black ethnic groups. Indeed, these groups tend to avoid depopulated inner-city black neighborhoods. Now, I described in my book, When Work Disappears, how the disappearance of work in these neighborhoods not only adversely affected individual families, but the social life of neighborhoods as well. And I pointed out that inner-city joblessness is a severe problem that is often overlooked or obscured when the focus is mainly on poverty and its consequences. I argued that despite increases in the concentration of poverty since 1970, inner cities have always featured high levels of poverty. But the level of inner city joblessness, especially in depopulated neighborhoods today, far exceeds that of earlier periods. And in explaining the growth of inner city jobless poverty, one has to first of all take into account the ways in which racial segregation interacts with other changes in the larger society to produce the recent escalating rates of neighborhood joblessness, including the nationwide decline in the fortunes of low-skilled workers and the growing suburbanization of jobs, not to mention jobs that have been relocated to cheaper labor areas overseas. Secondly, one has to consider the impact of changes in the class, racial, and demographic composition of the inner city neighborhoods, including, indeed, following the end of the great migration from the South and the steady out-migration of more advantaged families since 1970, the proportion of non-poor families and prime-age working adults has decreased sharply in many inner-city ghettos, especially in the Northeast and Midwest, and the city of Detroit is a prime example. The increasing and prolonged joblessness, the declining proportion of non-poor families, and the overall depopulation have made it more difficult to sustain basic institutions to achieve adequate levels of social organization in these neighborhoods. All of these changes have had a profound effect on the social organization of these neighborhoods, resulting in a weak institutional resource base. By that I mean this. You see, it is easy for parents to control the behavior of the children in their neighborhood when a strong institutional resource base exists, and when the links between communities, institutions, such as churches, schools, political organizations, businesses, and civic clubs are strong or secure. The higher the density and stability of formal organizations, the less illicit activities, such as drug trafficking, crime, prostitution, and the formation of gangs can take root in the neighborhood. Take drug trafficking. Research reveals an association between declining legitimate employment opportunities among inner city residents and increased incentives to sell drugs. In neighborhoods plagued by high levels of joblessness, insufficient economic opportunities, and high residential mobility are unable to control the volatile drug market and the violent crimes related to it. As a result, the behavior and norms in the drug market are more likely to influence the actions of others in the neighborhood, even those who are not directly involved in drug activity. Drug dealers escalate the use and spread of guns in the neighborhood, which in turn raises the likelihood that others, particularly youngsters, will come to view the possession of weapons as necessary or desirable for self-protection, settling disputes, gaining respect from peers and other individuals. And moreover, the drug industry actively recruits teenagers in the neighborhood, not only because they are willing to accept lower wages, but also because they tend to be more courageous and will take risks that more mature adults would avoid. Inner-city black youth with limited prospects for stable and attractive employment are easily lured into drug trafficking and therefore invariably find themselves involved in the violent behavior that accompanies it. The critically acclaimed HBO series The Wire brilliantly captures these neighborhood dynamics. If you haven't seen that episode, the series of The Wire, go buy the DVD and watch it. It's an amazing series. To repeat, a weak institutional resource base is what distinguishes high jobless inner-city neighborhoods from stable middle-class and working-class areas. As one resident of a high jobless neighborhood on the south side of Chicago put it, quote, "Our children, you know, seems to be more at risk than any other children there is, because there's no library for them to go to, there's not a center they can go to, there's no field house they can go into, there's nothing at all," unquote. And our research in Chicago revealed that parents in high jobless neighborhoods had a much more difficult task of controlling the behavior of their adolescents, of preventing them from getting involved in activities detrimental to pro-social development. And given the lack of organizational capacity and a weak institutional resource base in these neighborhoods, some parents chose to protect their children by isolating them from activities in the neighborhood, including the avoidance of contact and interaction with neighborhood families. And whenever possible, and often with great difficulty, when one considers the problems of transportation and limited financial resources, they attempted to establish contacts and cultivate relations with individuals, families, and institutions outside the neighborhood, such as church groups, schools, and community recreation programs. And some of them are exhausted. Some of these parents are exhausted trying to, keep their kids away from the dangerous activities they see. But I want to say that it's just as indefensible to treat inner-city residents as superheroes who overcome chronic racial and economic subordination as it is to view them as helpless victims. We should, however, appreciate the restricted range of choices that are available to inner-city families and residents in jobless neighborhoods because they live under constraints and face challenges that most people in the larger society do not experience or can't even imagine. And I wish there was a greater appreciation, greater awareness and appreciation of their incredible ordeals, especially among national policymakers. And I'd like to conclude by just emphasizing again a book that I have highlighted in this presentation, Sampson's Great American City, because it suggests some thoughtful policy interventions that flow from his theoretical arguments and empirical findings. And since Sampson recognizes the limitations of a policy to move large numbers of families out of the ghetto to combat concentrated poverty and joblessness, given the political realities of urban America. His proposed interventions highlight the importance of a place-based perspective. And based on the theoretical arguments and empirical findings in his book, Great American City, Sampson advocates a comprehensive approach to policy interventions for distressed areas of the city. Instead of moving people out of troubled neighborhoods, he makes the case for community-level interventions, as well as holistic policy interventions that recognize the important interconnected social fabric of American neighborhoods, or neighborhoods in American cities. And consistent with the theory and research of Great American City, this policy initiative would include a focus on strategies to integrate public safety intervention, such as regular meetings of local police and residents to co-identify problems, with broader non-crime policies that address the mediating social processes of social organization, such as opportunities to enhance citizen participation and mobilization. And this initiative would also include other theoretically relevant projects that are inextricably linked to neighborhood level dynamics, such as community economic development and citywide or metropolitan programs of mixed income housing that are connected with the dynamics of neighborhood migration. And all of these policy proposals are consistent with Sampson's focus on how government action, ranging from zoning decisions to interconnected housing and school policies, affect concentrated poverty, residential segregation, neighborhood stability, and most recently, home foreclosures. Sampson argues that given the historical evidence, the community structures are highly patterned policies focusing on community-level interventions and based on research knowledge about the mechanisms of urban change are more feasible and indeed more cost-effective over the long run than targeting individuals. And for all of these reasons, he sees the need to broaden our perspective of policy evaluation, which tends to focus almost exclusively on individual action. Since meaningful change depends on understanding the impact of ongoing neighborhood dynamics and social structures, these social processes should be an essential part of any program of evaluation. And Sampson contends that there is no intrinsic reason why social policy cannot address the realities of individual choice when intervening at the scale of the community and citywide social connections. However, the one thing that Sampson does not highlight is that any place-based program should take into consideration the important research of James Heckman at the University of Chicago economist. Heckman's research reveals the importance of investments early in children's lives, even before they are eligible for universal schooling. The effects that emerge when children's lives begin in nurturing and enriching environments can be cumulative. And early childhood investments are featured in a program that Sampson discussed in elaborating his place-based recommendations, Jeffrey Canada's Harlem Children's Center. Now, I suggest the broad-based interventions recommended by Sampson with few illusions that they are feasible in the current political climate. God, I'm not looking forward to November 4th. But it is important to think seriously about the kinds of projects we should discuss when a more favorable political environment does emerge. Don't throw up your hands in despair just yet. And I maintain that the thoughtful interventions, including the place-based initiative proposed by Robert Sampson, to be part of the discussion. Thank you for being such an attentive.